Before the Pimp Chronicles, Part 1, was a recording. Before the cameras ran, before the distribution deal was in place, before the special existed in any form that could be owned or revisited or recommended to someone who hadn't been in the room, it was a live set running on the road. A body of material in the process of being developed and refined, as all stand-up material is developed and refined, by being performed in rooms and adjusted by the feedback those rooms provide, until the material arrives at the form it will hold when the cameras finally document it. Somewhere in the road period before the taping, there was a first night when the full set ran in its final order. Not the taping night, that came later, but the night when all the material that would eventually constitute the special was performed, in sequence, for the first time in the configuration that the taping would eventually make permanent. The night the set became the set. That night was in Atlanta. Atlanta's relationship to the comedy circuit is specific and important. The city has functioned as one of the form's primary development environments for decades, a room that the circuit's serious performers treated as a proving ground, where audiences brought a specific quality of engagement that made the room more informative than many others of comparable size. The Atlanta comedy audience, in the era when the Pimp Chronicles was being developed, was the kind of audience that told a comedian the truth. Not the generous truth of a hometown crowd, not the polite truth of a room that has come for the name on the bill. The specific truth of an audience that has seen enough comedy to know the difference between the good version and the real version. Cat Williams had been in many Atlanta rooms before the night in question. The circuit had taken him through them at various points in the development of the material that would eventually become the special. He knew what the Atlanta audience gave back. He trusted the information. Here is the first thing about the Atlanta night that changes how everything that followed it should be understood. It was not planned as the first full run of the final set. It was simply the night when, for the first time, all the pieces happened to be in the form they were going to be in, and they ran in the right order, and the set became the set, in a room that had no idea it was witnessing a beginning. The closing section of the full set ran in Atlanta, and the room responded. Not in the measured, incremental way that a comedy audience builds its response to material that has been earning it across the course of an evening, in the specific way that a room responds when the closing section arrives at the destination the entire preceding hour has been building toward, without the audience having been consciously aware of the building. The response that is larger than the individual closing bit because it is the response to the whole evening arriving at once. This is the specific kind of response that a stand-up set earns when the architecture of it works. Not just the jokes being funny, but the construction being right, the sections in the right relationship to each other, the opening establishing what the closing needs the audience to already know, the middle filling in what the architecture requires without overloading it, the closing delivering what the preceding hour has made the audience ready to receive. When a set is built correctly, the audience's response to the closing is not just the response to the closing, it is the response to everything. What the Atlanta audience gave back to the closing section of the set that night was that kind of response. The particular fullness of a room that has received something complete, not just a good hour of comedy, but a good hour of comedy in which every part of the hour was in the right relationship to every other part. A response that told the comedian in the room that the construction was right. Not just the material, but the construction. Cat Williams received this from the stage in the specific way that a performer receives the information that the road is designed to provide, as confirmation of a decision that had been made tentatively and needed live rooms to confirm it. The Atlanta room confirmed the construction. What came after the Atlanta confirmation is the part of the story that most clearly shows what the road period between that night and the taping actually consisted of. Not continued revision of the material was confirmed. Not continued revision of the construction was confirmed. Something more specific. The preparation of the performance itself for the specific conditions of a taping, which are different from the conditions of a road show in ways that require specific preparation. Here is the third thing about the Atlanta night, and this one has to do with what the special eventually kept from the night and what it could not keep. The comedy set that became the Pimp Chronicles Part 1 was built over a road period that lasted long enough to allow the material to go through the full cycle of development that the circuit requires. The introduction of new material to a room, the reception of the room's response, the revision of the material in the direction the response indicates, the reintroduction of the revised material to a new room, and the continuation of this cycle until the material stabilizes into the form that will hold across many different rooms with many different audiences and still produce the response that the material is built to produce. This process is slower than it looks from the outside. The speed of it is the speed of the circuit's repetition, the speed at which a comedian can get in front of new rooms with revised material, which is determined by the touring schedule and the logistics of moving between venues. A good road run might produce 50 performances across many cities. Each performance is an experiment, and each experiment produces data. The material is refined by the data until the data stabilizes. By the Atlanta night, the material had stabilized. The separate sections of what would become the special were all in forms that the road had confirmed, individually, in various configurations, in many rooms. What the Atlanta night produced was the first time they ran in the specific sequence and the specific relationship to each other that the special would eventually document. This matters because a set is not simply the sum of its individual bits. The relationship between the bits, the way one section sets up the conditions for the next, the way the opening establishes a frame that the middle sections fill in, and that the closing section completes, is itself a construction. And it is a construction that only becomes visible when the bits run in the specific order that the construction requires. The Atlanta night was the first time the construction was visible in full, from opening to close. What the audience received that night was not the individual bits, which many of them may have encountered in earlier Atlanta shows. They received the full construction for the first time. And what the full construction produced in the room was different from what any individual bit had produced in isolation. Not just quantitatively different, more powerful, but qualitatively different, in the way that a completed thing is different from its components. Here is the second thing about that night, what happened after the closing section, that tells you most clearly what the room had understood about what it had received. The Pimp Chronicles Part 1 was eventually taped and distributed and became the recording that the audience who received it on television and DVD and later through streaming know as the special. The recording is the version of the set that most people have. The road version, the version that ran in Atlanta that night and in many rooms before and after Atlanta, is not the recording. It is something that existed in those rooms and was received by the people who were in them, and that no longer exists in any form except in those people's memories and in the effect it had on the taping that eventually documented the closest thing to it. This is the specific loss that the comedy special format always involves. The recording preserves the set. It does not preserve the live performance, the specific quality of aliveness that exists in a room where the comedian and the audience are in the same space at the same time, and the feedback loop between them is running. The Atlanta night had that quality. The recording of the Pimp Chronicles has what the recording could preserve, which is a great deal, but not that. The Atlanta audience received the first full run of the set that would become the special. They received it without knowing that was what they were receiving, without the context of the recording's subsequent reputation, without the frame that distribution and critical reception eventually put around the material. They received it as a comedy set, in a room, on a night when the room was full, and the set was new in its final form, and no one outside the room knew it had happened. That is the quality of the Atlanta night that cannot be recovered. The specific experience of receiving something extraordinary before it has been designated as extraordinary. The comedy audience's version of being in the room when the painting was still wet, when the thing is fully itself but has not yet been taken out of the studio to be seen. The Pimp Chronicles Part 1 is one of the most discussed stand-up specials of the 2000s. The Atlanta night that built it is not discussed. The Atlanta audience that received the first full run of the construction is not named or documented in any public account of the special's history. They were simply in the room. But here is what the Atlanta audience carried out of the room that night, and what they have been carrying since, without necessarily knowing what they were given. The experience of a comedy set arriving at the exact destination it was built to arrive at, in front of them, for the first time, before any other room received it, before the cameras, before the distribution, before the designation. Just the set and the room and the Atlanta audience who told the comedian, by the specific quality of what they gave back, that the construction was right. The road confirms the material, the audience confirms the set, and the Atlanta audience confirmed the Pimp Chronicles before anyone called it that, before the recording existed, before anyone outside the room knew what had just been built. That is what a live room holds that no recording can keep. And that is why the Atlanta night is the beginning of the story that everyone knows, even though almost no one knows it happened.